Which country fielded the most effective soldiers of World War II? To answer that, we must strip away propaganda and look at the soldier as a component of a war machine, a system where training, leadership, equipment, and doctrine create battlefield effectiveness. This is not a moral judgment. We will not measure armies by the righteousness of their cause. Our question is narrower. Which nation's military system produced the soldier who could fight, kill, survive, and win most effectively under the conditions of modern industrial warfare? Effectiveness is not courage alone. The Japanese soldier was fanatically brave, yet his army was crushed. It is not superior equipment. The Germans fielded revolutionary weapons but lost. It is not even a victory. What we're examining is the combat capability of the average frontline soldier as a product of his training, leadership, motivation, equipment, and adaptability. We will evaluate soldiers from 5 major belligerents: Germany, the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, and the Empire of Japan, using 5 core criteria. First, training and doctrine. How were soldiers prepared? Did their doctrine promote initiative or demand rigid obedience? Second, leadership and cohesion. How effective were NCOs and junior officers at making tactical decisions under fire and fostering unit cohesion? Third, morale and discipline. What motivated these men? How did their will to fight hold up under prolonged combat or crushing defeat? Fourth, equipment and logistics. Did the soldier have the right weapons, and could he rely on a steady supply? Fifth, battlefield performance and adaptability. How did these soldiers perform across different scenarios, and how well did they learn and adapt? We will examine kill-to-loss ratios where credible data exists, but also broader strategic impact. By the end, we will assemble a ranking of military systems and the soldiers they produced. The answer may surprise you. The German Lancer, masters of the tactical offensive. When World War II began in September 1939, the German soldier, the Lancer, was considered the best in the world. His army overran Poland in 4 weeks and shattered France and Britain in 6 weeks. This reputation was built on tactical excellence, professional leadership, and revolutionary doctrine. The foundation was Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. Senior commanders issued clear objectives, but junior leaders decided how to achieve them. A lieutenant did not wait for detailed instructions. He assessed the situation, identified opportunities, and acted. The system trusted corporals and sergeants to make battlefield decisions. This required different training. German recruits spent months in rigorous, realistic exercises, including live fire drills. The goal was to create thinking, adaptable combatants. The pinnacle was the Kampfgruppe, an ad hoc battle group, combining infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers under one commander. This flexibility gave the Germans an enormous advantage in the year 1939 to 1941. The flaw became apparent as the war dragged on. Auftragstaktik required professional, experienced leaders at every level. As casualties mounted on the Eastern Front, that supply dried up. By 1944, the average recruit received a fraction of the training his 1939 counterpart had. The professional NCO corps was bled white. Young, inexperienced leaders replaced them. The German NCO, the Feldwebel, was the system's linchpin. Often a veteran with years of service, he commanded immense respect through competence. Officers lived and fought alongside their men, fostering Kameradschaft, comradeship. This cohesion allowed German units to keep fighting when surrounded or outnumbered. It was common for a German unit reduced to a handful of men to still hold vital positions. But attrition eroded this. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, many junior leaders were teenagers with months of service. They fought with ferocity, but lacked the sophisticated leadership that characterized the early Wehrmacht. German morale in the early war was exceptionally high, fueled by stunning victories and national purpose. But the more enduring factor was primary group cohesion, the bond between squad mates. The German soldier fought for his comrades. Even in the final months when strategic defeat was obvious, German units often fought to the last man because their discipline and cohesion held. The German soldier was equipped with high-quality weaponry. The Kar-98K rifle was reliable and accurate. The MP-40 submachine gun was iconic, but the centerpiece was the machine gun. The MG-42 fired at 1,200 rounds per minute. Allied soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. German squads were built around protecting and supplying the MG-42. Late in the war, the Panzerfaust gave even poorly trained infantry a weapon against Allied armor. But Germany's industrial base could not compete. While German equipment was often superior, Tiger and Panther tanks were the best in firepower and armor. They were over-engineered and produced in insufficient numbers. A Tiger might destroy 5 Shermans, but the Americans had reserves. Worse was logistics. The German army relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. On the Eastern Front, supply lines were perpetually overstretched. Frontline units often lacked fuel, ammunition, and food. In tactical combat, particularly in the first half of the war, the German soldier was second to none. The Blitzkrieg campaigns showcased Auftragstaktik at its best. German units moved with fluidity and aggression that opponents could not match. On defense, they were masters of the fighting withdrawal and creating kill zones. A controversial post-war study by Colonel Trevor Dupuy concluded that German units consistently inflicted approximately 50% more casualties on British and American opponents than they received. While the methodology is debated, the general conclusion is supported by battlefield accounts and casualty records. The Wehrmacht proved adaptable. When Soviet T-34 tanks appeared, they rushed the development of better anti-tank guns and the Panther. When faced with Allied air supremacy, they developed sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses and new camouflage techniques. But there were limits. The German military was designed for short campaigns. Blitzkrieg was an economic necessity. As the conflict became a war of attrition against industrially superior enemies, the system broke down. The German Lancer of 1939 to 1942 was arguably the most effective individual soldier in the world. He was the product of superior doctrine, exceptional leadership, and tactical initiative. But he was also the product of a fragile system. As training degraded, leaders died, and logistics collapsed under a long multi-front war. The tactical Superman of 1940 became, by 1944, an undertrained teenager with obsolete equipment and no fuel. The Soviet Red Army soldier. 10. From chaos to conqueror. Over 8 million Soviet soldiers died between 1941 and 1945, more than all other major combatants combined. The Soviet soldiers' journey from poorly led, disorganized force on the brink of collapse in 1941 to the juggernaut that raised the red banner over Berlin is perhaps the most dramatic military transformation in history. In June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began, the Red Army was a catastrophe. Stalin's purges of the 1930s had executed or imprisoned an estimated 30,000 officers. The survivors were politically reliable but often militarily incompetent. Doctrine was rigid. Soviet commanders emphasized massed infantry assaults with little regard for casualties. Training was rudimentary. Many soldiers received only weeks of instruction in basic rifle marksmanship and political indoctrination. They were taught to shout, "Ura!" and charge. The results were horrific. In the opening months, German forces encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies. At Kiev in September 1941, over 650,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in a single encirclement. By December 1941, the Red Army had suffered over 4 million casualties. But the Soviet Union survived, and its army began a painful, bloody process of learning. The Soviets had a sophisticated pre-war doctrine called Glubokaya Operatsiya, deep battle. This called for combined arms operations to penetrate enemy lines, then exploit breakthroughs with mobile forces striking deep into the enemy rear. It was abandoned after the purges but slowly revived. By 1944, the Red Army had mastered it. Operation Bagration, in June 1944, was a deep battle perfected. Soviet forces smashed through German Army Group Center, advancing hundreds of kilometers and destroying 28 divisions, roughly 400,000 men. Soviet training evolved dramatically. In 1941–42, soldiers were often sent to the front with almost no preparation. But as the war continued, the Soviets developed effective specialized training. Sniper schools produced thousands of marksmen. Elite guard formations received better training and equipment. The entire Red Army adopted widespread use of the PPS-41 submachine gun with its 71-round drum magazine, creating immense close-range firepower. The Soviets became masters of camouflage and deception maskirovka. They learned to hide entire armies and launch surprise offensives. Most critically, they learned to fight in winter while the Germans froze. Early war leadership was crippled by dual command. Every military commander was shadowed by a political commissar who had to co-sign all orders. This created paralysis. The commissar system also enforced discipline through terror. Order number 227 in July 1942, not a step back, authorized blocking detachments positioned behind frontline troops to shoot anyone who retreated. Penal battalions, or Strafbats, were sent on suicide missions like clearing minefields by walking through them. Soviet military tribunals sentenced approximately 158,000 soldiers to death during the war, with around 135,000 executions carried out. Hundreds of thousands more were sent to penal units. But this brutal system slowly gave way to merit-based leadership. As incompetent officers died or were removed, tough professionals like Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky rose through the ranks. At the small unit level, sergeants and lieutenants who survived 1941–42 became some of the most experienced combat leaders on the planet. Soviet cohesion was based on shared suffering and burning hatred for the invaders who had brutalized their homeland. The Nazi policy of racial extermination, murdering civilians, deliberately starving prisoners, burning villages left Soviet soldiers with a stark choice: fight or die. The Great Patriotic War was a war of survival. Soviet motivation was a mix of ideology, terror, patriotism, and revenge. As the Red Army advanced into Germany, defensive fury transformed into vengeance. The atrocities committed by Soviet soldiers during the advance, mass rape, looting, murder, were war crimes enabled by a command structure that turned a blind eye. Soviet equipment reflected simplicity, ruggedness, and mass production. The Mosin Nagant rifle was an old bolt-action design, but nearly indestructible. It worked in mud, snow, and freezing temperatures. The PPS-41 submachine gun became iconic. Soviet doctrine evolved to equip entire units with submachine guns, creating storm groups for urban combat. The volume of fire was overwhelming. The T-34 tank was arguably the most influential armored vehicle of the war. Its sloped armor resisted German anti-tank guns. Its wide tracks gave excellent mobility, and it was produced in staggering numbers, over 84,000 during the war, more than all German tank production combined. The Katyusha rocket launcher could saturate huge areas with explosives in seconds. The howling shriek was almost as terrifying as the explosions. The Soviet Union's greatest logistical achievement was evacuating its industrial base. In fall 1941, they dismantled 1,523 industrial enterprises and shipped them east of the Ural Mountains. Workers rebuilt these factories and resumed production. American Lend-Lease aid was critical. The United States provided over 400,000 trucks and jeeps, giving the Red Army operational mobility. Soviet industry focused on tanks, artillery, and aircraft, while American trucks moved supplies. Soviet soldiers at the front were often poorly fed and clothed, but rarely lacked ammunition or artillery support. Soviet doctrine emphasized massed artillery fire. The sheer weight of explosives was staggering. Soviet battlefield performance evolved from catastrophic to world-class. In 1941, Soviet units launched poorly coordinated human wave attacks with horrific casualties. But they learned. At Stalingrad in 1942–43, they became masters of urban warfare. Small storm groups fought building to building, room by room. At Kursk, in July 1943, the Soviets constructed the most sophisticated defensive system ever seen, bleeding German panzer divisions white. By 1944–45, the Soviets had mastered operational warfare. Operations like Bagration demonstrated their ability to coordinate massive forces across hundreds of kilometers and sustain offensives for weeks. The Soviet soldier was exceptionally tough and resilient, capable of enduring hardships that would break most armies. He was a master of camouflage, infiltration, and night operations. But the Red Army remained crude in its methods, relying on mass and firepower. Casualty rates remained appallingly high even during victories. The Soviet soldier was often seen as expendable by his own command. The Soviet soldier was the anvil on which the German army was broken. His transformation from ill-prepared conscript to battle-hardened veteran is one of history's most significant military evolutions. He lacked the tactical finesse of his German counterpart, but his incredible resilience, backed by ruthless command and colossal industry, made him unstoppable. His effectiveness was built not on individual brilliance, but on collective endurance, overwhelming firepower, and willingness to pay any price for victory. The American GI, the well-supplied amateur, the American soldier, the GI, was unlike any other major combatant. He was not a product of militaristic culture or martial ideology. He was a civilian in uniform, a farmer from Iowa, a factory worker from Detroit, a college student from California drafted into service for a war his nation tried desperately to avoid. In 1940, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world in size, behind Romania. Pearl Harbor changed everything, but the American soldier remained at heart. A citizen soldier who wanted to do his job and go home. What made him effective was not warrior spirit, but the system behind him, the greatest industrial and logistical machine ever assembled, and his remarkable ability to learn and adapt. Initial training lasted 13 weeks at vast bases across the United States, covering fundamentals, weapons handling, physical fitness, drill, and basic tactics. It was structured but often criticized for not being realistic enough. Many soldiers learned their most important lessons in their first days of combat, a terrifying process called combat seasoning. Units that landed in North Africa or Sicily suffered disproportionately high casualties in first engagements as green troops made fatal mistakes. The Army improved training throughout the war, establishing realistic training centers and increasing live-fire exercises. Veteran NCOs rotated back to share experience with recruits. American doctrine reflected industrial strength, emphasizing firepower and overwhelming force. An American platoon was not expected to win through superior tactics, but to identify the enemy, fix him in place, and call in overwhelming supporting fire to destroy him. This supporting fire came at every level: company mortars, battalion heavy weapons, regimental artillery, and divisional, corps, and army-level assets, including air support. The American mantra was, "If you can see it, you can kill it." The American NCO was less a tactical genius and more a manager and small unit leader, responsible for keeping his squad functioning. Many were simply the best soldiers in their squad, promoted on merit. Quality varied widely, but the system worked because it was backed by a clear doctrine, good equipment, and overwhelming firepower. Junior officers, lieutenants, and captains were mass-produced through officer candidate schools. These 90-day wonders were often brave and willing to lead from the front. The casualty rate for infantry lieutenants was extremely high, but many lacked deep tactical grounding. However, they were typically well-educated and proved to be quick learners. Unit cohesion was built at the small unit level. The American soldier fought for his immediate buddies. The Army's greatest morale challenge was its replacement system. Instead of rotating entire units, individual replacements filled gaps in depleted squads. New soldiers arrived knowing no one and were treated as outsiders until they proved themselves. They had the highest casualty rates because they lacked experience and social bonds. The American soldier was not driven by ideology. He fought because his country was attacked and it was his duty. His motivation was pragmatic: get the job done and go home. This might seem less potent than fanaticism, but it had advantages. He did not suffer a crisis of faith when promises of victory proved hollow. Discipline was generally less rigid than in European armies. There was greater informality between officers and enlisted men, reflecting America's egalitarian society. This sometimes led to lack of military formality, but did not detract from combat effectiveness. The American soldier's greatest advantage was material. He was the best fed, best clothed, and best supplied soldier in the world. The American logistical system was a modern marvel. The M1 Garand rifle was a game-changer, the first semi-automatic rifle issued as a standard infantry weapon to any army. While others fired bolt-action rifles requiring manual cycling, the GI could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. General George Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. The firepower advantage cannot be overstated. An American rifle squad could put more bullets downrange than a comparable German squad. The M1 carbine was issued to officers and support troops. The Thompson submachine gun and M3 grease gun provided close-range firepower. The Browning automatic rifle served as the squad automatic weapon. The bazooka gave infantry portable anti-tank capability. Supporting arms were where American firepower truly dominated. American artillery was legendary. The 105mm howitzer was reliable, accurate, and produced in enormous quantities. Artillery battalions responded to fire missions within minutes. The most devastating technique was time on target. Multiple batteries calculated firing solutions, so shells from dozens of guns arrived simultaneously. German soldiers described these barrages as appearing from nowhere with no warning. American industrial capacity meant ammunition was never in short supply. Artillery units could fire thousands of rounds without worrying about running out. The logistical system was equally impressive. Liberty ships were built so quickly that one launched every day at peak production. Over 2.5 million trucks moved supplies from ports to the front line. American soldiers received regular hot meals, mail from home, world-class medical care, and luxuries like cigarettes and Coca-Cola. This material superiority had a profound psychological effect. The soldier knew he was backed by an industrial machine that would provide whatever he needed to win. The American debut was not impressive. In November 1942, Operation Torch put troops into combat against veteran German forces. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, green American units were roughly handled by Rommel. It was humiliating, but the United States Army proved to be a remarkably fast-learning organization. Incompetent commanders were relieved, tactics were adjusted, combined arms coordination improved. By the Sicily invasion in July 1943, American units performed far better. In Normandy, on June 6, 1944, American forces landed on Utah and Omaha beaches. Fighting was brutal at Omaha, but American firepower, naval guns, artillery, and air support eventually overwhelmed defenders. The subsequent campaign in Norman hedgerows was grinding and attritional. The bocage was ideal defensive terrain. American progress was slow and costly. But soldiers adapted, developing new tactics and improvising welding devices on tanks to break through obstacles. By Operation Cobra in late July 1944, the American Army was a seasoned, effective force. The pursuit across France demonstrated American strengths: operational mobility, logistical superiority, and the ability to coordinate large formations. In the Pacific, American soldiers and Marines faced a completely different war. Japanese forces fought from concealed positions, launched night attacks and banzai charges, and refused to surrender. American troops developed new tactics based on overwhelming firepower, flamethrowers, naval bombardment, aerial bombing, and maximum rate artillery fire. American soldiers showed remarkable adaptability. They learned from mistakes, adopted new tactics, and integrated lessons from the British. The United States Army of 1944 was vastly more capable than the army that landed in North Africa in 1942. The American soldier also displayed initiative from his civilian background. Unlike soldiers raised in authoritarian societies, the average GI grew up valuing individualism and problem-solving. He was good at improvising and making things work. The American GI represents the triumph of the citizen soldier backed by overwhelming industrial power. He was not a natural warrior and lacked the tactical sophistication of the German or the fanatical determination of the Japanese. But he was part of a system that learned quickly, adapted effectively, and could bring to bear material resources his enemies could not match. His greatest strength was integration into a military machine emphasizing firepower over finesse, logistics over ideology, and systematic problem-solving over individual heroics. He could afford to make mistakes because he had resources to recover. He could advance methodically because he had artillery and air support to suppress resistance. By 1945, the American soldier had evolved from amateur to professional. He had learned the business of war through hard experience. He was not the most skilled individual combatant, but part of the most powerful and adaptable military system the world had ever seen. The British Tommy and the Commonwealth soldier, NS, the Bulldog breed. The British soldier, the Tommy, and his Commonwealth comrades fought in every major theatre from Norway to Burma, from the Western Desert to the Rhine. They began with outdated equipment and were driven from the continent at Dunkirk. They ended the war as a tough, professional force that had mastered methodical, firepower-intensive warfare. The British Army's story is one of resilience, holding the line when all seemed lost, learning from defeat, and slowly grinding down the enemy through patient, professional application of force. Britain entered war with a small professional army designed for policing its empire. The British Expeditionary Force sent to France in 1939 was well trained but ill-equipped for German blitzkrieg. British tanks were slow and undergunned. Anti-tank weapons were inadequate. When the Germans attacked in May 1940, the BEF was outmaneuvered and nearly destroyed. The Dunkirk evacuation in May to June 1940 saved over 300,000 troops, but was a devastating defeat. The British Army left behind virtually all its heavy equipment. Britain now stood alone, and its army had to be rebuilt from scratch. The rebuilding process under leaders like Bernard Montgomery produced doctrine, emphasizing careful planning, methodical force concentration, and overwhelming use of artillery and air support. This became the set-piece battle. The idea was to grip the enemy, fix them with infantry and artillery, then systematically destroy them with superior firepower. It was the antithesis of fluid German Auftragstaktik. British commanders wanted control, coordination, and certainty. This approach was slow and predictable, but effective when properly executed. At the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, Montgomery's 8th Army demonstrated the set-piece battle at its best. After weeks of preparation, British forces launched a meticulously planned offensive that ground through German and Italian defences. Rommel's Afrika Korps was forced to retreat and never recovered. British training emphasised professionalism and fundamentals. Recruits underwent rigorous basic training in weapons handling, fitness, and drill. British NCOs were famously stern and meticulous, demanding perfection in appearance and equipment maintenance. This created soldiers who were reliable and steady under fire. Specialized training became sophisticated. Commandos trained for amphibious raids. The Special Air Service pioneered long-range desert reconnaissance and sabotage. The Chindits learned to operate in the Burmese jungle for months, supplied by air. Commonwealth nations brought their own expertise. Canadian forces became experts in amphibious operations. Australian and New Zealand troops, Anzacs, were renowned for aggressive patrolling and infantry skills in desert and jungle. Indian Army divisions fought with distinction in North Africa, Italy, and Burma. The heart of the British Army was the regimental system. British soldiers were recruited into specific regiments with centuries of history: the Black Watch, Coldstream Guards, the Gurkhas. This fostered intense local pride and loyalty. A man from Yorkshire joining the Green Howards followed in his father's and grandfather's footsteps. He fought for the honour of his regiment and the men from his hometown. The British NCO was the system's bedrock, a figure of immense authority and experience, known for professionalism and unflappable demeanour. British sergeants were masters who had often served for a decade or more, commanding respect through competence. The officer corps was traditionally drawn from upper classes, but the war forced greater meritocracy. Battlefield commissions became more common. British officers were known for bravery and sense of duty. The concept of noblesse oblige meant they were expected to lead from the front and share hardships. Casualty rates among junior officers reflected this. British morale was defined by stubborn, understated resilience, less about fervent ideology and more about duty, professional pride, and dry, cynical humour in adversity. After being driven from the continent in 1940, the British soldier fought with grim determination. Britain was fighting for survival. After France fell, it stood alone against Nazi Germany. The threat of invasion was real. The Blitz killed tens of thousands. Every soldier understood this was an existential struggle. Discipline was strict and traditional. The army emphasized smartness, drill, and obedience. Soldiers maintained uniforms and equipment to exacting standards, even in combat. This emphasis on discipline and routine instilled mental fortitude to withstand battle stress. British soldiers became known for steadiness in defense and ability to hold ground under immense pressure. They were less likely to panic than less disciplined forces. This made them ideal for defensive operations, where holding position mattered most. British equipment at war's start was inadequate. British tanks in France were slow, unreliable, and poorly armed. However, British industry mobilized effectively, and with American Lend-Lease, the Tommy became well-equipped by mid-war. The Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle was outstanding. Its 10-round magazine was larger than most bolt-action rifles, and its smooth bolt allowed trained soldiers to achieve astonishing rate of fire. British soldiers practiced the Mad Minute, firing 15 aimed shots in 60 seconds at 300 yards. Some experts exceeded 30 rounds per minute, rivaling semi-automatic weapons. The Bren gun was one of the best light machine guns of the war. Accurate, reliable, easy to control. British infantry sections were built around the Bren, much as German squads were built around the MG42. The Sten gun was cheap, crude, and ugly, stamped from sheet metal and produced quickly. It looked like a plumber's nightmare, but it worked. Millions were produced, equipping British forces and resistance movements across occupied Europe. The 25-pounder gun howitzer became the Royal Artillery's workhorse, versatile, accurate, firing both high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. British artillery doctrine emphasized complex fire plans coordinated across multiple batteries. The Royal Artillery became masters of the creeping barrage and defensive fire that could bring devastating firepower within minutes. Logistics were challenging. The global nature of the war stretched supply lines to breaking point. Forces in the Western Desert had to be supplied across thousands of miles of ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, then overland across Egypt and Libya. In northwest Europe after D-Day, British forces were generally well supplied, but in Burma, the forgotten army endured terrible conditions with limited resources. The British soldier was at his best in well-planned, deliberate operations, where his strengths, professionalism, discipline, artillery support could be utilized. El Alamein was the perfect example. Montgomery spent weeks preparing, assembled overwhelming superiority, conducted deception operations. When the offensive began, it proceeded methodically as planned. In the Norman campaign after D-Day, British and Canadian forces faced the bulk of German armoured reserves. Fighting around Caen in June to July 1944 was brutal and attritional. German panzer divisions counterattacked repeatedly, but British forces ground down German armour, forcing them to commit strength to hold Caen while American forces prepared for Western breakout. British soldiers excelled in defense. At Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, British paratroopers held out for 9 days against overwhelming German forces, inflicting heavy casualties. The ability to hold ground against odds was a defining characteristic. Britain pioneered modern special forces. Commandos, established in 1940, conducted raids on German-occupied Europe. The Special Air Service, formed in North Africa in 1941, conducted deep penetration raids behind enemy lines, destroying hundreds of aircraft and disrupting supply lines. The Special Boat Service operated in the Mediterranean and Aegean. The Long-Range Desert Group conducted reconnaissance hundreds of miles into the Sahara. These units had impact far beyond their size, forcing Germans to divert significant resources to rear area security and demonstrating that the British could strike anywhere. The British Army's methodical approach could be a weakness. Operations would pause to allow supplies to catch up, to prepare the next attack, to ensure coordination. This gave agile enemies time to escape or reinforce. Operation Market Garden in September 1944 was a rare British attempt at bold, rapid operation, and it ended in costly failure. The plan was to drop airborne forces to seize bridges while armor raced up a single road. It was un-British in audacity, and execution suffered from overconfidence and poor intelligence. Some historians argue British cautiousness prevented them from exploiting opportunities as aggressively as they might, but this overlooks Britain's strategic reality. Britain could not afford the casualties the Soviets accepted or losses the Americans could sustain. British commanders had to husband strength. The methodical approach reflected a nation fighting a long war with limited resources. The British and Commonwealth soldier was a consummate professional, tough, resilient, disciplined, and reliable. His army lacked the tactical flair of the Germans or overwhelming material power of the Americans, but it was highly competent and versatile, capable of fighting in any environment. The Tommy's greatest virtue was endurance and steadfastness. He held the line alone in 1940. He defeated the Afrika Korps in North Africa. He fought up Italy. He ground down elite German panzer divisions in Normandy. He crossed the Rhine into Germany's heart. In Burma, he defeated the Japanese in the most difficult terrain imaginable. He was the bulldog of the Allied cause, stubborn, determined, and tenacious. He might not have been the most innovative or aggressive soldier, but he was one you could count on to do his job, hold his ground, and see the war through to the end. The Imperial Japanese soldier, the spirit warrior. The soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army was perhaps the most alien and terrifying opponent faced by Western allies. He fought with fanaticism and disregard for death that was almost incomprehensible to his enemies. His effectiveness was rooted not in superior technology or sophisticated doctrine, but in a warrior code, brutal training, and unshakable belief in the divinity of his emperor and manifest destiny of Japan. Japanese military doctrine was built on Seishin Kuiku spiritual training, which emphasized that fighting spirit, Yamato Damashi, could overcome any material or numerical disadvantage. The Imperial Japanese Army's tactical doctrine prioritized offensive action at all costs. The preferred tactic was the bayonet charge banzai charge, often conducted at night to maximize shock and terror. Japanese forces were masters of infiltration, camouflage, and jungle warfare. Defensive doctrine was simple: hold a position to the last man. Surrender was unthinkable and seen as ultimate disgrace. Training was exceptionally brutal, both physically and mentally. Recruits were subjected to constant beatings and humiliation by NCOs, a practice intended to strip away individualism and instill unquestioning obedience. Training emphasized physical toughness, martial arts, and proficiency with the bayonet. Marksmanship was often neglected in favor of fostering aggressive spirit. This system created soldiers who were incredibly tough and obedient, but often lacked tactical flexibility and initiative. Leadership in the Imperial Japanese Army was based on absolute authority and harsh discipline. Officers and NCOs held power of life and death over their men, and physical abuse was routine. This created a culture of fear and blind obedience. Cohesion was intense but brittle. It was based on shared, fanatical loyalty to the emperor and the unit. This allowed Japanese units to fight on in hopeless situations long after Western units would have surrendered. However, this rigid system stifled initiative. The average soldier was not expected to think, only to obey. If his officer was killed, a Japanese squad could become confused and ineffective, often reverting to suicidal charges. They lacked the adaptable NCOs of the German army, who could take command and continue the mission. The Japanese soldiers' morale was driven by a powerful combination of factors. Bushido, a romanticized warrior code emphasizing honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, taught that death in battle for the emperor was the highest honor. The emperor was considered a living god, and every soldier fought in his name. Propaganda told Japanese soldiers that allies were racially inferior barbarians who would torture and kill prisoners. This, combined with the shame of surrender, meant many Japanese soldiers fought to the death or committed suicide rather than be captured. Discipline was absolute and enforced with brutal efficiency. This fanaticism made the Japanese soldier terrifying, but was also a strategic weakness. The refusal to surrender meant experienced soldiers and entire garrisons were needlessly annihilated in battles like Saipan and Okinawa, with no possibility of preserving veteran manpower. This was the Japanese army's greatest weakness. Japan was an industrializing nation, but could not compete with Western powers. The average Japanese soldier was poorly equipped by 1942 standards. The Arisaka Type 99 rifle was a long, cumbersome but reliable bolt-action rifle. The Type 99 light machine gun and Type 92 heavy machine gun were decent but unremarkable. The knee mortar Type 89 grenade discharger was a very effective and widely used infantry support weapon, but the Japanese squad lacked a semi-automatic rifle and had few submachine guns. Their tanks were generally small, thinly armored, and no match for American Shermans. Artillery was consistently outmatched. Logistics was the Achilles heel of the Japanese military. Their doctrine emphasized short, decisive campaigns, and they had little capacity for sustained warfare. Soldiers were expected to live off the land, which worked in the initial conquest of Southeast Asia, but became a death sentence on isolated Pacific islands like Guadalcanal, where thousands of Japanese soldiers starved to death. In the early stages of the Pacific War, the Japanese soldier was highly effective. His experience from the war in China, his expertise in jungle warfare, and sheer ferocity of his attacks overwhelmed Allied forces in Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines. He was a master of night attacks, infiltration, and building well-camouflaged defensive positions. However, the Japanese military proved remarkably unadaptable. They continued to launch banzai charges against entrenched American positions defended by machine guns and artillery, with predictable and catastrophic results. They failed to develop effective combined arms tactics or counter the overwhelming American superiority in firepower. The Imperial Japanese Army was a poor learning institution. Mistakes were repeated and doctrine remained static. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the industrial, attritional war they were fighting against the United States. At Guadalcanal in the year 1942 to 1943, the breaking point became clear. Japanese forces, unable to resupply their garrison, starved. Repeated banzai charges against marine positions were mowed down by concentrated firepower. Japanese tactical rigidity met American material superiority, and the result was slaughter. At Saipan in 1944, when the island's fall became inevitable, Japanese soldiers and civilians committed mass suicide rather than surrender. Thousands jumped from cliffs. At Okinawa in 1945, the same pattern repeated on a larger scale. Japanese defensive tactics had evolved. They built deeply fortified positions and avoided wasteful banzai charges, but the fundamental problem remained. They could not adapt quickly enough, could not match American firepower, and could not sustain their forces logistically. The Imperial Japanese soldier was one of the most fearsome individual combatants of the war. His fanatical courage, toughness, and mastery of jungle warfare made him a formidable foe. However, He was the product of a brittle and ultimately flawed system. His effectiveness was based on spiritual fanaticism that could not compensate for poor equipment, abysmal logistics, and rigid doctrine that failed to adapt to changing realities. He was a sharp sword that shattered against the industrial anvil of the Allied war machine. His story is a cautionary tale about the limits of individual courage and fighting spirit when divorced from sound doctrine, adequate logistics, and institutional adaptability. Head-to-head, when they met, on the battlefield. To truly understand soldier effectiveness, we must examine what happened when these armies faced each other in combat. Doctrine, training, and equipment mean nothing without the test of battle. Here we will analyze 3 critical matchups that defined the war. Eastern Front in the year 1943. German tactical excellence versus Soviet operational mass. The Battle of Kursk in July of the year 1943 was the largest tank battle in history and a direct test of German tactical skill against Soviet operational planning. After the disaster at Stalingrad, the Germans needed a victory. Operation Citadel aimed to pinch off the Kursk salient, encircle Soviet forces, and regain the initiative. The Germans assembled approximately 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks including new Tigers and Panthers, and 2,000 aircraft. They would attack from north and south to meet in the middle. German tactical doctrine, even in the year 1943, remained superior. Their combined arms coordination, their use of battle groups, their aggressive junior leadership, all were still formidable. But the Soviets had learned. They knew the attack was coming. Soviet intelligence, aided by the British breaking German codes, gave them weeks of warning. They used that time to construct the most sophisticated defensive system ever built. The Soviets dug multiple defensive belts, stretching over 100 miles deep. They laid over 1 million mines. They positioned thousands of anti-tank guns in interlocking fields of fire. They prepared artillery fire plans that could saturate any sector within minutes, and they held massive armored reserves to counterattack any breakthrough. When the Germans attacked on July 5th, they ran into a buzzsaw. German tactical skill allowed them to penetrate the first defensive belt, then the second. Tiger tanks knocked out 34s at long range. German infantry and engineers cleared paths through minefields, but the advance was measured in miles, not the dozens of miles per day of earlier campaigns. The attrition was catastrophic. German panzer divisions that began the battle with 200 tanks ended it with 40 or 50. The Soviets lost more tanks, over 1,600 destroyed compared to perhaps 760 German tanks, but they had reserves. They could afford the losses. The Germans could not. By July 12th, the southern pincer stalled. The northern pincer had already ground to a halt. The Germans called off the offensive. They had achieved tactical successes, local breakthroughs, favorable kill ratios in many engagements, but suffered operational defeat. The Soviet system absorbed the blow and broke the German offensive power. This was the pattern on the Eastern Front after the year 1943. German soldiers remained tactically superior man for man. They inflicted higher casualties than they received in most engagements. But Soviet operational skill, overwhelming numbers, and willingness to pay the butcher's bill meant tactical excellence was not enough. Normandy in the year 1944. The grinding match. The Normandy campaign after D-Day pitted British, Canadian, and American forces against the Wehrmacht in a 2-month attritional struggle. The campaign revealed the strengths and weaknesses of all combatants. British and Canadian forces faced the bulk of German armored reserves around Caen. The Germans committed elite SS Panzer divisions, the 1st SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, 12th SS Hitler Youth, Panzer Lehr Division. These were among the best equipped and most fanatical German units in existence. The fighting was brutal. German defenders used the bocage-dense hedgerows to create ambush positions and kill zones. A single German Panther tank in a hull-down position could dominate a road junction. German NCOs led small battle groups that repeatedly counterattacked British advances. British progress was slow. Montgomery's set-piece battles, Operations Epsom, Goodwood, Charnwood, ground forward but at heavy cost. But this was Montgomery's strategy. He wanted to tie down German armor, to force them to commit reserves, to hold Caen, to bleed them in attritional combat. While the Germans focused on holding the British sector, American forces prepared for the breakout in the west. The casualty exchange rates reveal the pattern. German forces consistently inflicted more casualties than they received. In tank versus tank combat, German Panthers and Tigers dominated Allied armor, but the British and Canadians kept coming. They had more tanks, more artillery, more men. They could afford losses the Germans could not. By late July, German armored divisions around Caen were shadows of their former strength. The 12th SS Hitler Youth Division, which began the campaign with 20,000 men and over 150 tanks, was reduced to a few thousand infantry and a handful of operational tanks. The tactical skill of German soldiers had not diminished, but their combat power had been ground down. When the Americans launched Operation Cobra on July 25th, the breakout succeeded partly because German reserves were pinned around Caen. The subsequent encirclement at Falaise destroyed much of the German 7th Army. Normandy demonstrated that tactical excellence without adequate resources and replacements leads to defeat. The German soldier in Normandy fought with skill and determination, but was ultimately overwhelmed by enemies who could sustain losses and maintain pressure indefinitely. Pacific in the year 1944. Industrial firepower versus fanatical defense. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific was a direct contest between American industrial firepower and Japanese fanatical defense. Each island battle followed a similar pattern, but Peleliu, in September through November of the year 1944, illustrates the dynamic clearly. Peleliu was a small coral island in the Palau group, needed to secure the flank for the invasion of the Philippines. Japanese forces numbered about 11,000 men under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. American forces, primarily the 1st Marine Division, numbered about 28,000. The Japanese had learned from earlier disasters. No more wasteful banzai charges. Instead, they built an elaborate system of caves and bunkers in Peleliu's ridges, connected by tunnels. They positioned artillery and mortars to fire from concealed positions, then withdraw into caves before American counter-battery fire arrived. They prepared to fight to the last man, but to make the Americans pay for every yard. The Americans landed on September 15th, after days of naval bombardment and airstrikes. American commanders expected to secure the island in 4 days. It took 73 days. The Marines advanced into a killing ground. Japanese soldiers fired from concealed positions, then disappeared into tunnels before they could be engaged. American tanks and infantry were hit by fire from multiple directions. The usual American advantages, air power, naval gunfire, artillery, were less effective against an enemy underground. The Americans adapted. They brought up flamethrower tanks to burn Japanese soldiers out of caves. They used explosive charges to seal cave entrances. They developed tactics for clearing each fortified position methodically. But the cost was staggering. The 1st Marine Division suffered over 6,500 casualties, nearly 40%. The Japanese garrison was almost entirely annihilated, only 202 captured out of 11,000. The casualty exchange ratio was roughly 1.7 Japanese dead for each American casualty, far lower than American superiority in firepower and numbers should have produced. Peleliu demonstrated that even a poorly supplied, outgunned force with inferior doctrine could inflict terrible casualties if soldiers were willing to die to the last man and had time to prepare defenses. But it also demonstrated the ultimate futility of such tactics. The island fell, the Japanese garrison was destroyed, and the Americans, despite heavy losses, could replace their casualties and move on to the next island. By Iwo Jima in February of the year 1945 and Okinawa in April through June of the year 1945, the pattern continued. Japanese forces fought from fortified positions with suicidal determination. American forces brought overwhelming firepower battleship guns, artillery, flamethrowers, bombs, and advanced methodically. The casualty exchange improved as Americans refined their tactics, but the human cost remained horrific. These three matchups reveal core truths about soldier effectiveness. Tactical skill matters, but not as much as operational planning and strategic resources. Courage and determination matter, but not as much as adaptability and logistics. The German soldier was tactically superior to his opponents throughout most of the war, but superior tactics could not overcome systemic weaknesses in logistics and industrial capacity. The Japanese soldier was incredibly brave, but bravery without adaptability and adequate supply led only to annihilation. The Soviet and American soldiers were part of systems that could learn, adapt, and sustain themselves, and those systemic advantages ultimately determined victory. The 5 criteria. A final accounting. We've now examined each nation's soldiers through 5 distinct lenses, but to truly understand who had the most effective fighting force, we need to evaluate them systematically side by side across these same criteria. Let's begin with training and doctrine. Germany's Auftragstaktik set the gold standard. It promoted initiative, flexibility, and independent thinking on the battlefield. Between 1939 and 1942, the German soldier was the product of the most advanced tactical training system in the world. But that brilliance couldn't last. By 1944, their training system had collapsed under the strain of war. The Soviet Union started with little more than chaos. Training was crude, uncoordinated, and often deadly for recruits. But by 1944, through sheer necessity, the Red Army mastered operational warfare through its deep battle doctrine, transforming itself from the worst trained force to one of the most capable. The Americans trained methodically. Their system produced competent soldiers, though not as tactically sharp as their German counterparts. Their doctrine emphasized firepower over finesse. Less sophisticated, yes, but backed by overwhelming resources, it worked. British training stressed professionalism and discipline. Their set-piece battle doctrine was methodical, less flexible than the Germans, but steady, reliable, and sustainable. Japanese soldiers, on the other hand, were taught to fight with spirit, not skill. Their doctrine glorified the offensive, demanded death before surrender, and never evolved. Ranking for training and doctrine: first, Germany at its peak; second, the Soviet Union by 1944; third, the United States; fourth, the United Kingdom; fifth, Japan. Now, leadership and cohesion. The German non-commissioned officers, the NCO Corps, were unmatched, empowered, disciplined, and tactically brilliant. Junior officers led from the front, forging deep Kameradschaft. Yet by the final years of the war, attrition wiped out that core of excellence. The British NCOs were stern professionals. Their regimental system bred loyalty and stability. Leadership remained competent and steady throughout the war. American NCOs varied in quality, but the system functioned. Junior officers learned fast under fire. Cohesion was strong, even though the replacement system often disrupted unit bonds. Soviet leadership evolved from disastrous to capable. Early blunders in 1941 gave way to a hardened officer corps by 1944. Cohesion came not from friendship, but from shared suffering and raw patriotism. Japanese leadership was rigid and authoritarian. Their cohesion was driven by fear and emperor worship, intense but fragile. Ranking for leadership and cohesion: first, Germany at its peak; second, the United Kingdom; third, the United States; fourth, the Soviet Union; fifth, Japan. Now, morale and discipline. German morale stayed high even in defeat. Unit cohesion, tradition, and iron discipline kept their army fighting long past the point of collapse. Japanese morale was fanatical. Fueled by Bushido and loyalty to the emperor, it created warriors willing to die, but also commanders willing to waste them. Soviet morale was complicated. It ran on terror, patriotism, and vengeance. Discipline came at gunpoint, blocking detachments, executions, fear. But it worked. The British maintained steady professional morale rooted in duty and regimental pride. Strict discipline, quiet resolve, unbroken will. American morale was practical, less rigid, more human. The replacement system hurt, but the soldiers adapted, endured, and kept going. Ranking for morale and discipline: first, Japan, for sheer intensity. Second, Germany. Third, the Soviet Union. Fourth, the United Kingdom. Fifth, the United States. Then, equipment and logistics. The United States was in a class of its own. The M1 Garand, plentiful artillery, endless trucks, and total air supremacy. By 1944, the American soldier was the best supplied in the world. Germany's weapons were excellent, but there weren't enough of them. Their logistics, still horse-drawn in many units, were a fatal flaw. Britain's equipment improved over time. Logistics were stretched thin across the globe, but adequate where it mattered most. The Soviets focused on simplicity and mass production. The T-34 was the workhorse of the war, rugged, reliable, and deadly. Logistics improved dramatically with American Lend-Lease aid. Japan lagged behind. Outdated weapons, poor production, and catastrophic logistics left their soldiers starving on isolated islands. Ranking for equipment and logistics: first, the United States. Second, the Soviet Union by 1943. Third, the United Kingdom. Fourth, Germany. Fifth, Japan. Finally, battlefield performance and adaptability. From 1939 to 1943, the German army performed brilliantly. Their adaptability and tactical innovation defined early blitzkrieg warfare. But as the war dragged on, they struggled with attrition and logistics they could never solve. American forces adapted faster than anyone. They learned from failure, replaced incompetent leaders, and mastered combined arms warfare. By 1944, they were formidable. Soviet forces transformed from shattered remnants in 1941 to a juggernaut by 1944. Their learning curve was the steepest in the war's history. The British remained steady and professional. They excelled in defense, in set-piece engagements, and pioneered special operations. The Japanese fought fiercely early on, especially in the jungles. But they never learned. Their tactics stagnated, and they paid for it with their lives. Ranking for performance and adaptability: first, the United States. Second, Germany at its peak. Third, the Soviet Union. Fourth, the United Kingdom. Fifth, Japan. When you step back and look at the complete picture, a pattern emerges. Germany excelled in training, leadership, and peak tactical performance, but failed in logistics. The United States dominated in equipment and adaptability, performing strongly across all categories. The Soviet Union began in chaos, but transformed into a highly effective war machine. Britain was consistent and professional, though rarely exceptional. And Japan, while fierce and fanatical, collapsed under the weight of its own inflexibility. The verdict: ranking the world's most effective soldiers. We have analyzed 5 armies across 5 criteria and examined them in head-to-head combat. Now we must deliver the verdict. This ranking represents the overall, sustained effectiveness of the average soldier as part of his military system throughout the war. Number 5. The Empire of Japan. The Imperial Japanese soldier was one of the most fearsome individual warriors of the Second World War. His fanatical courage, exceptional toughness, and mastery of jungle warfare in the early campaigns made him a terrifying opponent. In the year 1941 and in the year 1942, Japanese forces achieved stunning victories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But he ranks last because he was the product of a fundamentally broken system. His effectiveness was based on spiritual fanaticism that could not compensate for poor equipment, abysmal logistics, and rigid doctrine that refused to adapt. Japanese soldiers starved on isolated islands because their army had no capacity to sustain them. They launched suicidal banzai charges against machine guns and artillery because their doctrine never evolved. They fought to the last man in hopeless situations, wasting veteran manpower that could never be replaced. The Japanese military was a poor learning institution. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of industrial warfare. By the year 1944, Japanese tactical methods that had shocked the Allies in the year 1941 were predictable and easily countered. The Japanese soldiers' individual courage and skill could not overcome these systemic failures. The Japanese soldier's story is a cautionary tale about the limits of fighting spirit divorced from sound doctrine, adequate logistics, and institutional adaptability. He was a sharp blade that shattered against the industrial might of his enemies. Number 4. The United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. The British Tommy and his Commonwealth comrades were consummate professionals. They rank fourth, not because they were inferior soldiers, but because they lacked the tactical brilliance of higher-ranked armies or the overwhelming material superiority of the Americans. What they did have was steadiness, resilience, and professional competence. The British soldier was reliable and could be counted on to hold his ground under immense pressure. The regimental system created powerful unit cohesion. The NCO Corps was stern and professional. British training emphasized fundamentals and discipline. British doctrine, the set-piece battle, was methodical and cautious. It was not flashy or innovative, but it worked. At El Alamein, the British demonstrated they could plan and execute complex operations effectively. In Normandy, they ground down elite German panzer divisions in attritional combat. In Burma, they defeated Japanese forces in terrible conditions. Britain also pioneered special operations warfare. The Commandos, the SAS, the SBS, and the Long-Range Desert Group had an impact far beyond their small numbers. The British Army's methodical approach could be a weakness. They sometimes sacrificed speed for certainty. But this reflected Britain's strategic reality as a nation fighting a long war with limited manpower. They could not afford reckless casualties. The British soldier was the Bulldog, stubborn, determined, professional. He held the line alone in the year 1940 and fought in every theatre for the entire war. He may not have been the most innovative or powerful, but he was reliable, tough, and saw the job through to the end. Number 3. The Soviet Union. The Soviet Red Army soldier's placement at number 3 reflects one of history's most remarkable military transformations. He went from the catastrophic defeats of the year 1941, when the Red Army seemed on the verge of total collapse, to becoming part of the force that smashed the Wehrmacht and conquered Berlin. The Soviet soldier ranks third because his effectiveness was not based on individual tactical excellence, but on collective endurance, overwhelming operational power, and willingness to pay any price for victory. Soviet training evolved from rudimentary to sophisticated. By the year 1944, Guards formations were elite units, and the Red Army had mastered operational warfare through deep battle doctrine. Soviet equipment, particularly the 34 tank and massed artillery, was simple, rugged, and produced in staggering quantities. But Soviet methods remained crude. Casualty rates stayed horrifically high, even in victories. Soldiers were often treated as expendable resources. Discipline was enforced through blocking detachments and mass executions. The Soviet system was brutal to its own soldiers, yet the Soviet soldier's resilience was unmatched. He could endure hardships that would break other armies. He learned to master urban warfare at Stalingrad, created sophisticated defenses at Kursk, and executed massive offensives like Operation Bagration by the year 1944. The Soviet soldier was the anvil on which the German army was broken. He bore the brunt of the Wehrmacht's fury and ultimately destroyed it. His effectiveness came not from tactical finesse, but from toughness, operational skill, and the backing of massive industrial power. He paid the highest price, over 8 million military dead. But he achieved what no other army could. He marched from the gates of Moscow to Berlin and planted his flag on the Reichstag. Number 2. The United States. The American G.I. earns second place through the triumph of the citizen soldier, backed by overwhelming industrial power and embedded in a military system capable of rapid learning and adaptation. The American soldier was not a natural warrior. He lacked the tactical sophistication of the German soldier and the fanatical determination of the Japanese. He started the war as an amateur. The defeats at Kasserine Pass and early Pacific engagements proved that. But the American military was the best learning organization of the war. Incompetent leaders were ruthlessly removed. Tactics were adjusted based on combat experience. Training improved. By Normandy in the year 1944, American forces were executing sophisticated combined arms operations. The American soldier's greatest advantage was his equipment and supply. The Monet-Garand gave him a direct firepower edge over enemies with bolt-action rifles. American artillery was legendary for its speed and accuracy. Air support was overwhelming. And American logistics meant he never lacked ammunition, food, medical care, or reinforcements. American doctrine emphasized using firepower to save lives. Why send men across open ground when artillery could obliterate the enemy first? This approach was methodical and sometimes slow, but it was effective and reflected American values. Technological superiority should minimize American casualties. The American soldier also displayed adaptability born from his civilian background. He was good at improvising, problem-solving, and making things work. This can-do attitude served him well in combat's chaos. By the year 1945, the American soldier had evolved from amateur to professional. He was not the most skilled individual combatant, but he was part of the most powerful and adaptable military system ever created. That systemic excellence made him devastatingly effective. Number 1. Germany. The German Lanzer, particularly from the year 1939 through the year 1942, was the most effective individual soldier of the Second World War. He earns the top ranking despite Germany's ultimate defeat because effectiveness is measured by combat performance, not strategic victory. The German soldier was the product of the most sophisticated tactical training system in the world. Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, created soldiers who could think independently, exploit opportunities, and adapt to chaos. German NCOs were tactical masters who could lead battle groups and make life-or-death decisions. German junior officers were aggressive and competent. German soldiers were respected and feared by every army they faced. The Dupuy analysis, despite its controversies, supports what battlefield accounts consistently show. Man for man, the German soldier inflicted higher casualties than he received. In tactical engagements, German units regularly defeated larger enemy forces through superior training, leadership, and combined arms coordination. The MG-42 machine gun, the Kampfgruppe concept, the aggressive use of armor and infantry. Together, these were tactical innovations that gave Germans enormous advantages. Even on defense, German forces were masters of the fighting withdrawal and counterattack. German soldiers maintained discipline and cohesion even in catastrophic defeat. Units fought to the last man not because they still believed in Nazi ideology, but because their training and unit bonds held. But there is a critical caveat. The German military system was fragile. It required professional leaders, realistic training, and adequate logistics. As the war dragged on and these elements degraded, German effectiveness declined. The 1944 German recruit was not the 1939 professional. Germany's placement at number 1 is based on peak performance. At their best, German soldiers were unmatched in tactical proficiency. They achieved stunning victories against numerically superior foes. They inflicted disproportionate casualties throughout the war. Even in defeat, even when outnumbered and outgunned, they remained dangerous opponents. The German soldier's effectiveness was individual and tactical. He was the best trained, best led, most tactically proficient soldier of the war. That is why he ranks first, even though his nation lost, and even though the system that produced him ultimately failed. Conclusion: the soldier and the system. World War II was not won by superhuman warriors. It was won by systems of doctrine, training, leadership, industry, and logistics. The effectiveness of any individual soldier was ultimately a reflection of the strength and resilience of the system that produced and sustained him. The German Lancer demonstrated that tactical brilliance and superior training can achieve incredible victories. At the squad, platoon, and company level, German soldiers consistently outfought their opponents. They were masters of combined arms warfare, aggressive in attack, tenacious in defense. But the German story is also a cautionary tale. Tactical excellence alone cannot win a war of attrition against industrialized superpowers. The German military system was designed for short, decisive campaigns. When forced into a long, multi-front war against enemies with greater resources, the system broke down. Superior training could not compensate for inadequate logistics. Professional NCOs could not be replaced once killed. The sharp blade was ultimately shattered by overwhelming force. The American GI proved that a citizen soldier, when properly equipped and integrated into a flexible learning system, could defeat more martially inclined foes. The American soldier was not naturally superior to his enemies. He was often less tactically sophisticated than the German, less fanatically determined than the Japanese. But he was part of a military machine that emphasized firepower over finesse, logistics over ideology, and systematic problem-solving over individual heroic. The American system could afford mistakes because it had the industrial capacity to recover. It could advance methodically because it had the artillery and air support to suppress resistance. Most importantly, it could learn. The United States military identified weaknesses, adjusted tactics, and improved performance faster than any other army. This systemic adaptability, combined with overwhelming material superiority, made the American soldier ultimately victorious. The Soviet soldier's journey embodies the terrible arithmetic of industrial warfare. His transformation from the poorly led conscript of 1941 to the battle-hardened conqueror of 1945 came at a cost almost incomprehensible. Over 8 million Soviet soldiers died. Millions more were wounded. Entire generations were decimated. The Soviet system treated its soldiers as resources to be expended. Discipline was enforced through terror. Casualties that would have broken other armies were simply accepted as the price of victory, yet the Soviet soldier endured. He learned to fight in winter, to master urban warfare, to execute massive offensive operations. By 1944, the Red Army had become a sophisticated operational force capable of destroying German army groups in weeks. Soviet effectiveness was not elegant or humane, but it was real. The soldier who raised the red banner over the Reichstag had earned his place in history through unimaginable sacrifice and brutal effectiveness. The British Tommy represented professional competence and steady reliability. He was not flashy or innovative, but he was dependable. The British Army's methodical approach reflected a nation fighting a long war with limited resources. British soldiers could not afford the casualties Americans or Soviets accepted. They developed a style of warfare that minimized risk through careful planning and overwhelming firepower at decisive points. This approach was sometimes criticized as cautious, but it was successful. The British soldier held the line alone in 1940 when Nazi Germany dominated Europe. He defeated Rommel in North Africa. He ground down German armor in Normandy. He fought in every theater for the entire war. His steady professionalism was a crucial component of Allied victory. The Japanese soldier's fate illustrates the tragic futility of courage divorced from sound strategy. Individual Japanese soldiers were among the bravest, toughest, most skilled jungle fighters of the war. But they were betrayed by a system that valued spiritual determination over material reality, that refused to adapt failed tactics, that could not supply its forces, and that sent men to die in hopeless situations rather than preserve them for future battles. Japanese fanaticism created terrifying opponents but led to strategic disaster. Every garrison that fought to the last man was a garrison of veterans who could never train the next generation. Every banzai charge against machine guns was a waste of soldiers who could have been used more effectively. The Japanese soldier's story is a reminder that individual effectiveness means nothing without systemic competence. What does this analysis teach us about warfare and military effectiveness? Several lessons emerge. First, tactical proficiency matters. but operational and strategic competence matter more. The Germans won most tactical engagements but lost the war. Superior tactics could not overcome inadequate logistics and insufficient industrial capacity. The Soviets and Americans built systems that could sustain large-scale operations over years. That systemic superiority ultimately determined the war's outcome. Second, adaptability is more valuable than initial quality. The American and Soviet armies of 1945 bore little resemblance to their 1941 predecessors. They learned from mistakes, adjusted doctrine, improved training, and developed new tactics. The Japanese army of 1945 used the same methods that failed in 1942. Institutional learning capacity determined which armies improved and which stagnated. Third, logistics and industry are inseparable from soldier effectiveness. The best trained soldier in the world is useless without ammunition, fuel, food, and medical support. The German soldiers' tactical excellence was gradually eroded by logistical failure. The American and Soviet soldiers' effectiveness grew as their nations' industrial machines reached full production. Modern war is industrial war, and industrial capacity determines what is possible on the battlefield. Fourth, morale and cohesion at the small unit level are essential but not sufficient. German, Japanese, British, and Soviet soldiers all demonstrated powerful unit bonds and willingness to fight under terrible conditions. But morale alone could not compensate for systemic failures. The question is not just whether soldiers will fight, but whether the system supporting them can sustain that fight. Finally, there is no perfect soldier. Each nation's military reflected its society's values, resources, and strategic situation. The German soldier was tactically brilliant but part of a fragile system designed for quick victory. The Soviet soldier was incredibly tough but treated as expendable. The American soldier was well supplied but initially inexperienced. The British soldier was professional but cautious. The Japanese soldier was brave but inflexible. Each had strengths and weaknesses, shaped by their national context. The question we set out to answer, which country had the most effective soldiers of World War II, has no simple answer. It depends on how we define effectiveness and what timeframe we examine. At peak performance, the German soldier was unmatched in tactical proficiency. Over the entire war, considering adaptability and systemic support, the American soldier was the most successful. In terms of sheer impact on the war's outcome, the Soviet soldier bore the greatest burden and inflicted the most damage on the Wehrmacht. But perhaps the most important insight is that the soldier alone does not determine victory. The Second World War was won by nations that could mobilize their societies, adapt their strategies, sustain their logistics, and maintain their will to fight over years of grinding combat. The individual soldier, however skilled or brave, was ultimately a component in a vast machine. The nations that built the best machines that could learn, adapt, produce, and sustain were the nations that won. We honor the soldiers of all nations who fought and died in World War II by understanding them clearly, not through the lens of mythology, but through careful analysis of what made them effective or ineffective. They were products of their time and their systems. Some were betrayed by those systems. Others were empowered by them. All deserve to be remembered, not as propaganda figures, but as human beings who fought under the most terrible conditions imaginable. The verdict stands. Germany produced the most tactically effective individual soldier at peak performance, but the United States produced the most successful soldier-system combination, and the Soviet Union produced the soldier who ultimately did the most to win the war. Each answer is correct depending on the question we ask, and that complexity is perhaps the most honest conclusion we can reach about a conflict that claimed over 70 million lives and forever changed the world.